1642, England was a country divided. Civil war raged. There were many reasons, still not properly understood. Early in 1642, there was a great constitutional crisis, a quarrel between King Charles I and members of Parliament over appointments to the army. There was also a fierce struggle for supremacy in the Church of England. People we would now call Congregationalists and Presbyterians, then lumped together as Puritans, were all inside the church but opposed to each other and against the king's preferred Anglican faith.
Charles was certainly deeply unpopular for the way he levied new taxes, ship money for example, and for not calling a parliament for such a long time. The Scots rejected the king's new prayer book and rebelled, so that by 1639 the king needed an English army. To pay for it, he had to call Parliament to approve traditional taxes. But MPs just used the king's shortage of cash to extract administrative reforms from him. Massacres of Protestants in Ireland in 1641 brought demands for revenge. But MPs couldn't trust Charles with command over any army after he attempted to use troops to arrest 5 of their number in January 1642.
In other words, Charles I asserted a divine right to rule, and some people, such as John Pym, suspected that by this he meant a divine right to do as he pleased. During the summer and autumn of 1642, the House of Commons and the King sent out conflicting instructions about recruiting troops. People everywhere were driven to take sides. On August the 22nd, Charles at Nottingham Castle declared all who opposed him rebels. A civil war had started.
Large armies met in battle. Towns and country houses were besieged with disastrous consequences in terms of bloodshed, hardship, and disease. This is the story of one siege and one battle at Nantwich in Cheshire through December 1643 and January 1644.
Nantwich was the parliamentary headquarters in Cheshire, and its garrison built earthworks all round the town for protection. In December 1643, an army from Royalist Chester, commanded by Lord Byron, set out to attack Nantwich. Byron's cavalry were from Oxford. Some of his infantry regiments, including Protestant Irishmen, had recently been shipped across from Ireland, where they had been fighting Catholics. Byron's troops cleared scattered groups of parliamentarians from villages surrounding Nantwich. For example, men led by Captain Sandford climbed over the walls of Beeston Castle, one of the parliamentary outposts, and the governor, Captain Steele, had to surrender. He retreated with his force of about 60 men to Nantwich, and a newspaper at the time gave one version of what happened next.
It is also further certified that Captain Steele, who perfidiously delivered up Beeston Castle to the enemy, had also conspired with the Cavaliers to betray Nantwich, which he caused to accomplish after this manner. He first caused himself to be laid into a cart, like a wounded or maimed soldier, and then advised them to guard him with a party of horse to Nantwich, and that a considerable number of horse and foot should follow immediately after them. That upon their approach to Nantwich, the enemy's soldiers should request the guard there to let in one of their commanders who had been wounded, and afterwards they were to rush in and enter the town, and the rest to follow after them, which was performed according to the contrivance. But the faithful guard at Nantwich not only refused to let them pass, but also laid hold of this impostor, and discovered him, took the party of horse, and prevented the rest from entrance.
Steele was shot for his treachery and buried in Nantwich, as the church burial register records. Byron now set siege to Nantwich just before Christmas 1643, when incidents such as that at Bartomley attracted a lot of publicity. This one involved Lord Brereton, a royalist, not to be confused with Sir William Brereton, the commander of parliamentarian forces in Cheshire.
divers of the Cheshire Protestants shut themselves into Bartonley Church for their refuge against Lord Byron and his army, who at his summons yielded upon quarter granted them, and many of them came out. 15 of them had gotten into the steeple, to whom the Lord Brereton would grant no quarter unless they first stripped of their clothes and threw them down, which they did. And then he commanded them to put off their shirts and come down naked, whereunto they also yielded. And these poor naked creatures were no sooner down, but that bloody Lord commanded his soldiers to put them all to the sword, which was most cruelly executed and performed.
Reports like this, whether true or false, embittered both parties as Byron tightened the siege in January 1644 and started bombarding the town. We know about these actions because they were recorded by a local resident, Thomas Malbon. He was a Puritan supporter of Parliament and, for example, wrote in his journal,
"The King's forces, having compassed the town round, continued their alarms against the town both day and night. On Wednesday night they, having planted a great piece of ordnance near Dorfold House, did, about 11 o'clock in the night, shoot and discharge many hot red bullets into the town, whereof one of them did light in a hovel of kids of Mr. Thomas Wilbraham's, at the upper end of Welsh Row, towards Dorfold, and set the same on fire. But through God's mercy, and help of many women carrying water and taking great pains, for the men durst not remove from the walls, did quench the same, little harm being done."
Wilbraham's house, called Townsend House, stood on this site. Curiously, Thomas's son Roger, long afterwards, wrote about the same incident when the hovel of kids, what we call a store of firewood, was set alight. At the time, though, he had other things to think about, being, as he said,
senseless of the danger we're in, under a sore fever.
The townspeople faced other dangers and hardships living in a garrison town run by a council of war. Mrs. Minshall, a tenant in one of Lord Cholmondeley's properties, preserved her rent demands from this period because she was compelled to pay the money to the Parliamentary Council instead. One of the notes she received was as follows.
13th of September 1643. Mrs. Minshall is ordered to send in her rent presently, or so much thereof as she hath ready to pay soldiers, which being now ready to go forth of town. Or else the soldiers will come for it themselves, which will be more chargeable unto her. Signed, Thomas Malbon, George Edgley, Robert Wilkes.
Mrs. Minshall later reported to the council, in respect of a tenancy agreement she had with her brother, that
a company of soldiers out of this town came and took away 148 cheeses and brought them to this town, where they are now, and which indeed your petitioner was to have had towards the satisfaction of her said brother's rent.
Sounds like a case of soldiers plundering farmers' storehouses, doesn't it? Physical dangers were frightening. John Davenport's daughter was killed by cannon shot while helping to put out the fire at Townsend House. This gate was once part of that house. Thomas Dutton's house, perhaps looking somewhat like this, and beyond the earth walls constructed to defend the town, was occupied by Royalist troops, so a parliamentary force sallied out to remove them, burned 2 cottages to the ground, took 3 prisoners, and reputedly killed 9 or 10 enemy at no cost to themselves. The result of one Royalist early morning assault was reported by Thomas Malbon.
"The King's forces fled when it was fair daylight, no faster than their legs would carry them, leaving behind them their scaling ladders, and some of their arms, and about 100 dead bodies, which they could not take with them, and many wounded."
Heavy snowfalls caused conditions in the town to become even more wretched as the Royalist siege wore on.
No market was kept, nor any provision or fuel brought to the town, and many cattle kept within the walls, and neither hay nor straw could be had for them, in regard of the great store of horse for service kept in the town, so that things began to be scarce for man and horse.
Royalist newspapers anticipated a quick surrender. They boasted that Byron had 7,000 troops and control of much of South Cheshire. But Nantwich was important strategically to Parliament, and Sir Thomas Fairfax was instructed to collect forces in Lincolnshire, Lancashire and Cheshire to relieve the besieged town.
Out of Lancashire, it is informed that Sir William Brereton and Sir Thomas Fairfax met with the chiefest of the Lancashire gentry at Manchester, where they celebrated a fast, and on the next day mustered the forces from Leek, Ashbourne and Manchester to the number of 8,000 horse and foot, from whence they marched to relieve the siege of Nantwich.
This parliamentary army travelled south from Manchester and camped overnight on Tilston Heath, despite the wintry weather. Next morning, January 25th, Fairfax ordered a march towards Hurleston, overrunning an outpost of Royalists and then pushing on towards Acton. Lord Byron anticipated Fairfax's arrival by setting Colonel Gibson the previous day, January the 24th, to deploy infantry and artillery around Acton Church, where the ground was slightly higher. Overnight, a thaw set in. The River Weaver rose rapidly, flooding meadows on the Acton side and sweeping away a temporary bridge, which had been constructed to replace Beam Bridge, itself destroyed somewhat earlier. Years later, Sir Thomas Fairfax recalled what happened that day.
We marched to Nantwich, which was at the point of surrendering. When we came within a day's march, I had intelligence that Lord Byron intended to meet us in the field. I put my men in the order in which I intended to fight, and continued my march until we came within 3 miles of the town. There was a pass kept with about 250 men. I sent Colonel Morgan with his dragoons, who beat them off. We marched until we came within cannon shot of their works, where half their army was drawn up, and we were informed that the river which runs through the town, being raised by the melting snow, hindered those that lay on the other side from joining with them. We called a council of war, wherein it was debated whether we should attempt those in their works, being divided from the rest of the army, or march into the town and relieve them, and by the increase of our force be better able the next day to encounter them. This last we resolved on, and making way with pioneers through the hedges, we marched to the town.
As you can see, what Fairfax attempted was risky. A march across the front of an enemy assembled to his right, with movement to his left restricted by flooded meadows. By the time Fairfax made up his mind to do this, Lord Byron managed to get his other troops over the river. They marched 6 miles, Byron said afterwards, but they were the ones who attacked first, falling on Fairfax's rear guard. Lord Byron some time later claimed, in a letter,
"At the first encounter we had much the better of them, both our wings clearly beating both theirs, and were possessed of many of their colours, and had given them a total defeat, had not Colonel Warren's and Sir Michael Ernley's men at the same time, notwithstanding all the endeavours of their officers, retreated without almost fighting a stroke, so that the enemy's battle fell into the flanks of both our wings."
Fairfax's account was somewhat different.
Being a little advanced, they told me the enemy was close upon the rear. So facing about 2 regiments, being Colonel Holland's and Colonel Booth's, I marched not far before we came to be engaged with the greatest part of their army. Then the other part presently afterwards assaulted our front. There Sir William Brereton and Colonel Ashton did good service, and so did Colonel Lambert and Major Copley with the horse.
There is one mystery about this battle. How did Byron's forces from Beam Heath, probably cavalry, cross the river? Byron was decidedly vague when he wrote of the events afterwards.
It fell out, unfortunately, that the night before we fought with them, a small river that ran betwixt our quarters swelled so upon the falling of the rain and the melting of the snow that one part of our army was forced to march 6 miles before it could join with the other.
He did not admit that it was his cavalry who were cut off, but by being so definite about the 6-mile march, he raised the question of which bridge was used, Church Minshall, which would be more than a 6-mile trip, or Shrewbridge, which looks like a much shorter route. Expert historians differ. One local author has suggested he used a bridge at Brains Farm, by the mill, which certainly existed here later. However, no supporting documentary evidence has yet been found.
The orthodox answer is Shrewbridge, with the need to ride clear of floods, explaining a march remembered afterwards as about 6 miles. Both Fairfax and Byron agreed that all the cavalry was seriously hindered by numerous hedges enclosing small fields. It's also clear that after initial losses, the Parliamentary infantry in the centre overcame Sir Michael Ernley's foot regiment, one of the ones from Ireland, and this undermined the whole of the Royalist attack.
Even so, Fairfax might not have won had not a great sortie of musketeers from out of town crossed Nantwich Bridge, routed an infantry regiment guarding the road to Acton, and threatened Byron's rear. The Royalist infantry fell back to Acton churchyard, were surrounded and eventually surrendered. The entire cavalry left hurriedly for Chester, but Byron said he stayed for 2 hours more.
I stayed above 2 hours after the business of the foot was done to try if anything could be done for the recovery of the cannon and the carriages, but all was in vain. So I was forced to retreat to Chester with what foot I could gather together of several regiments, which were betwixt 1,000 and 1,200 men, where we now are in a sad condition, the enemy braving us to the gates of Chester.
Thomas Morburn thought that over 1,500 Royalist prisoners were locked in the parish church for safety after the parliamentary victory. A long list of captured officers was issued, and one newspaper reported the capture of
27 wagons laden with spoils taken by the Irish forces from the inhabitants of those parts. Besides, there were taken about 120 Irish women with long knives to cut the throats of such as they should take prisoners or find wounded.
Fighting around Nantwich was not ended, and the war in the nation continued for another 2.5 years. The defeat at Nantwich inflicted on Byron's mixed force of Irish and English ended the king's hopes that reinforcements from Ireland would bring him military victory. For Parliament, the victory at Nantwich was a great morale booster, just before they received the huge advantage of a Scots army as an ally. Byron went on to join Prince Rupert. In June 1644 at Marston Moor, he tasted an even more disastrous defeat at the hands of Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell. Nantwich remained a garrison town until the king surrendered to his enemies in May 1646, and then it sought once more to adjust to a time of uneasy peace.